Good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Maya, the Program Associate for Village Preservation. I'm so glad you're here with us this evening. I'm just going to tell you a few words about village preservation before we can begin. Here at Village Preservation, we have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We have secured landmark designation of more than 1,250 buildings in our neighborhoods and zoning protections for nearly 100 blocks. We host 75 free programs a year, and we hope you will join us for a future program. Our events cover a wide range of topics focused on the history of art and architecture and culture of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo, and the important role of historic preservation in our communities and our lives. We look at the roles of everything from local small businesses to independent cultural institutions, civil rights, and the social justice movements, great artists, writers, musicals, dancers, and others connected to the creative legacy of our neighborhoods, as well as the irreplaceable and unique built environments of our neighborhoods. We are a member-based organization, so your support is essential to enabling us to provide this free programming for our community and continue our advocacy and preservation work. If you like what we do, join or make a donation. You can scan right here if you'd like to do that now. You can learn more at our website, Village Preservation, and please consider becoming a member or making a donation if you're able to at villagepreservation.org/donate. So just a bit of Zoom protocol. If you have questions for our speaker specifically, please use the Q&A function. No need to wait to submit your questions. We'll get to all your questions either during the presentation or after in our Q&A session. Now, before we introduce our speaker, if you're interested in more programs about artists, tomorrow Village Preservation and EVC NYC are hosting an artist talk at Tompkins Square Library featuring the artist Lily Annabelles on her exhibit Goodbye to Brick and Mortar. So please think about joining us for this event as well. Lastly, I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker. Dina Tass-Winter is a historic preservationist, writer, and Village Preservation's own Director of Research and Preservation. A native New Yorker and Greenwich Village resident, she holds an MA in Historic Preservation and Cultural Heritage Management from the University of York, UK, and a BA in Music History from the University of Rochester. In 2022, she co-edited the volume of Experiencing Olmsted, the enduring legacy of Frederick Law Olmsted, New North American Landscapes. Now, please, I'll take it over to Dina.
Thank you so much, Maya. I'm just going to share my screen to show the presentation deck. All right. Yes, so as Maya said, my name is Dina, and I'm the Director of Research and Preservation here at Village Preservation. And just one more quick housekeeping thing in tandem with what Maya was saying about putting questions into the Q&A box. We will definitely be happy to answer as many questions as we have time for. I'm going to run through the entirety of my presentation without stopping for questions, but feel free to ask questions along the way. Maya will be keeping an eye on it and will help me kind of guide the Q&A session once my presentation concludes. So just very briefly, a little bit about myself. Maya already gave you my kind of little bio there, but as she mentioned, my background is really in historic preservation. And I'm quite interested in the history of artists, visual artists in our neighborhood. And so it's been really fun to dig into this research, but I also, my expertise is a little bit more on the architectural history and landscape history side specifically. So the way I've kind of framed this presentation is to, it's a little bit of like a virtual walking tour. As an architectural historian, I always like to place myself in physical space and kind of understand the relationship of the buildings to each other. And that's actually really relevant to how we've framed this research. I'll get into that in a moment and show you a couple of maps that kind of place us in that space. But yeah, so as we go through, you'll see a lot of different buildings. I'll talk a little bit about the architectural history of the buildings themselves, and then we will get into the artists who lived, worked, and created in these spaces. So I wanted to start by just kind of framing the conversation around why south of Union Square, I'll put it in quotes. It's not our ploy to create like a new name for a neighborhood or anything like that. South of Union Square is actually a facet of, or a small area within what we think of as Greenwich Village. And I'll explain why we've decided to talk about it that way. So as I'm sure you all know, Greenwich Village is on the map on the left here. It's basically south of 14th Street, middle to west side, and there's tons of layers of cultural heritage that have happened in this neighborhood over the past 2 centuries, and visual artists are just one aspect of this. And there are plenty of visual artists who have lived and currently live all over Greenwich Village. But to explain why we're focusing on a smaller area tonight and within our research, for one thing, a lot of the research surrounding artists living further west in the village is already kind of more well-known. Think of people like Roy Lichtenstein or Edward Hopper, these really big household names, though certainly there are tons and tons of artists of all different levels of recognition, and I'm sure many should be recognized more than they are. But I say all of that to say, if you look at the map on the right here, the yellow indicates areas that are historic districts, and the pink indicates individual landmarks. And this map represents kind of the overall area that Village Preservation has purview over: Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. But I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but I'll talk you through it either way. The central area here, just to the right of the main yellow Greenwich Village Historic District, as you can see, doesn't have the same historic preservation protections. There are a select few individual landmarks right there in the middle of the map, and a lot of that is thanks to Village Preservation's advocacy efforts, which I'll talk more about in a little bit in relation to a couple of those buildings. But without the protection that landmarking provides, and also certain kind of zoning restrictions that may or may not be in place in this area, the Village Preservation identified this part of the village as an area that we needed to advocate more strongly for several years ago. And so that brings me to the South of Union Square proposed historic district. Like I said, this is something we've been working on for a few years. And on our website, we have a really great, very comprehensive map. And this is a screenshot of that map that talks about pretty much every single building within this area. They're mostly indicated in orange here, that we are proposing to achieve landmark protections for. And all of the artists that I'm going to talk about tonight live within or lived within these buildings. And you can see on the right-hand side here, we have a whole slew of heritage tours that you can peruse virtually at your leisure. But you can see here, it's alphabetical, and this is just a very small F to H snippet of the layers of history that we've revealed and are continuing to celebrate in this area. So tonight we're talking about visual artists, and we do have a visual artist tour already online that I recommend, and I'll remind you at the end how to access that. Much of what I'm talking about tonight is derived from that map, but there also is new research that we've uncovered recently, myself and others in the Village Preservation Office, that we're continually updating these maps. And as you'll see, there's just so much information. Hundreds of artists lived in this very concentrated area in a relatively short period of time. And so, yeah, it's always being updated with more, and I'm excited to tell you about some of the things that we don't even have as public information quite yet, but will soon. So last map for the moment, I promise. But as I said, we're going to go on kind of a virtual walking tour here. And our first stop is in this red bullseye. But I wanted to, you'll see this map over and over again as we walk around. And I'll highlight where we're going next. But just to kind of explain what's going on in this map also is certainly not comprehensive, but the green pinpoints indicate buildings that are still standing where artists have lived or worked. And the gray indicates buildings that have been lost, but where important visual artists lived. So we want to celebrate that heritage as well. And like I said, it's definitely not comprehensive. I can already think of a few more green dots that need to be added since the last time we revised this map. But one more thing about the map, I wanted to kind of touch on the concept of the buildings that are no longer standing. If you look here, you can see there's kind of like an arc that goes from 14th Street down to Broadway and 4th Avenue, where the majority of the now lost buildings were. And I think that there are a few explanations for that, but one of the main ones is that, as I'm sure most of or all of you can imagine and know, both 14th Street and that kind of Broadway corridor are these thoroughfares that had a lot of commercial activity over time, new businesses come and go. They're kind of hubs for change in the neighborhood. And so that is part of the reason why some of the significant buildings along those stretches are gone. However, a lot of the historic buildings and historic fabric still remains, which you'll see as we continue on in this presentation. And then the other pocket down here on East 9th Street, this was a slew of row houses, and we'll take a look at those in a little bit. But this was in the time kind of leading up to and just after World War II. The buildings on that particular stretch were kind of run down, and it was rife with opportunity for artists who didn't have a lot of money to move into that particular stretch. And so, you know, they may or may not have been squatting or at least paying low rent. And we've seen various records indicate that the amenities were not necessarily up to par. They may not have had heating or hot water, which leads us to question whether these artists just put their studios there and were living elsewhere, or perhaps they were kind of living in these spaces under not the best conditions. But at any rate, just to very briefly explain what happened, in the 1950s and 60s, developers saw an opportunity to knock down those smaller kind of unkempt buildings and bring in larger apartment buildings. So that's why there's a particular concentration right there of artists who were living there and then had to move out pretty quickly in the 50s and 60s. But I'll show you more about that soon. So a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight takes place in the early to mid 20th century. I'd say about 1930 to 1965, give or take. And I'll explain why that is in a moment. But I wanted to start this conversation by looking at this building here, 58 East 13th Street. And the reason is that this building, almost a century prior to the main time period that we're going to talk about, had a lot to do with making New York the epicenter of art and artistic expression. So the building was constructed in 1853 by Abraham Valentine, and it housed the National Academy of Design, which was the very first institution in the United States that was established by and under the exclusive control of professional artists, which included among its members many of the great American artists of the 19th and 20th centuries, and continues to do so. I wanted to share a quote from the architectural historian Christopher Gray, who stated that New York's most powerful art group during the 19th century is what was founded here. It was originally founded in 1825, but when this building was constructed in the 1850s, that's when the Academy moved in. And many artists and architects at the time were involved, and the mission of the Academy was and remains the promotion of the fine arts in America through exhibition and education. And so, like I said, you know, that's almost a full century before the kind of New York School of Artists that comes in and what we're mostly going to be talking about. But I think it's really incredible to know that for that long, this very concentrated area of the village has been home to such innovation in art. So as I've sort of already started to mention, we're going to mostly be talking about the New York School of Artists and people who were involved or kind of on the periphery of all of that. And if you don't know that much about it, it was kind of the groundbreaking place for abstract expressionism. It was a loose association of vanguard artists who were working in New York City beginning in the 1940s and 50s, and a little bit beyond that. And a lot of the artists who were involved from the get-go are people I'm sure you may have heard of, Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, and Mark Rothko, all of whom we'll hear about more later. And yes, like I said, abstract expressionism, which was a uniquely American avant-garde form of art, and it propelled New York City to eclipse Paris as the center of the art world. And though abstract expressionism, it's going to be a problem if I can't say that phrase well, but I'll keep trying. With abstract expressionism at its core, the artists were still stylistically diverse, and you'll see a lot of that as we look at examples. Within that typology, there was a lot of variety, and artists brought different media in and all different things. So we'll talk more about that. But it was really kind of boldly innovative, and it reflected a desire to embrace spontaneity and individual expression. Yeah, so I forgot to point out on my little map here, we're on 14th Street, kind of the northern edge of the area that we're looking at. And I wanted to start our mid-century discussion around 30 East 14th Street because it was such a massive hub of artists coming into these lofts between the 1930s and 1950s. And like I said, I love buildings, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about each building as we get into it. But one thing I wanted to point out is that you'll see Dylan Chandler's name a lot at the bottom of contemporary images. And that's because we received funding from the New York State Council on the Arts and the Preservation League of New York to sponsor a photographer to go around and take beautiful images of the standing buildings south of Union Square. So we're proud to have that at our disposal, and that's a lot of the contemporary images that you see. A lot of the older photographs that I'm showing will be 1940s tax photographs. If you hadn't heard about that, in the 1940s, the city of New York had a project where they took photographs of every single block and lot in all 5 boroughs. So it's this really incredibly rich resource for architectural and other historians who want to see what buildings looked like at that point in time. I use it all the time in all sorts of aspects of my research, but in this particular endeavor, it's been really fascinating because if you think, 1939 to 1942 or so, when they took all of these images, is also right around the time that a lot of these artists lived in this area. So we're getting to see what the streetscape looked like while the artists were inhabiting the space. So in this case, you can see a lot has changed. This building here with the kind of projecting piece is what was 30 East 14th Street. It's still the same building at its core, but tons happened post 1940s. You can see it was completely reclad. The windows are even a different shape and size, smaller. Obviously, the ground floor storefronts are very modern and have, existing current businesses, but the upper floors are clearly not in the grand shape that they once were. But during the 1940s, when it was so much more beautiful, there were just dozens of artists that came and went renting loft space in this building. And one thing that is really cool, I think, is this Yasuo Koniyoshi, who is one of the artists that I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. Here he is in his studio at 30 East 14th Street, probably right around the 1940s. And you can see the interior of the window. And that's just a really special opportunity as an architectural historian in New York. It's often difficult to find interior shots, but you can see here even the angle of the side of the window matches the angle of the exterior. So you know that you're kind of in the place and time that you're meant to be. And then just very briefly, while we're still looking at these pictures, the adjacent 28 East 14th Street, which clearly retains a lot more of its intricate historic fabric, also had some artists in it. I know specifically the artist Nathaniel Dirk was there in the early 1930s. I'm sure there are others too. But let's look at some of the folks who are at 30 East 14th Street. So Kenneth Hayes Miller, he was living there from 1932 to 1950, so really right at the center of this time period that we're looking at, and spanning the time from the Great Depression to post-World War II time. He was one of the foremost teachers of the Art Students League, which is an artist-founded institution that began in 1875. And it really also helped to catapult the American art scene into the global spotlight. Many others during this presentation were also involved in some capacity, either as teachers or students, and I'll try to point that out. But looking at his work, first I wanted to mention that he was in the area as early as 1923. He was at 6 East 14th Street, which is technically just outside of our purview, as it were, but is obviously still within the neighborhood. And he was at 30 East 14th Street, like I said, for at least 2 decades. And during this time, he became known for his depiction of the salesgirls and shoppers that filled 14th Street and the Union Square neighborhood. So that's what you can see in these examples of his work. And that was also kind of part and parcel to his involvement and the development of the 14th Street School of Artists, which included Reginald March, Paul Cadmus, Isabel Bishop, and Miller. And that was kind of a subset of the Art Students League. And yeah, the subject matter of their work, as you can see with Kenneth Hayes Miller, examined seemingly common occurrences around the daily life of their immediate surroundings on the 14th Street corridor and nearby. I have this quote that says 14th Street at the time was referred to as the poor man's Fifth Avenue. So it was really becoming this much more diverse, less well-to-do, more commercial hub kind of space. And these artists were capturing that. Virginia Admiral also lived in the building, and she was there from 1940 to 1943. She and Robert De Niro Sr. got married in 1942, and then he joined her there. He also was an artist. If you recognize the name, their son is Robert De Niro, the actor, and he probably lived there maybe briefly in his infancy as well. But his parents were both artists, and you can see examples of their work here. I've tried whenever I could to find examples of artwork that were created either during the time or close to the time that the artists were living in these spaces. Sometimes it's trickier than others from my online searching of finding examples of work. But in this case, you can see Admiral's work on the right here was created during the time that she was living in the building. And they were both involved in abstract expressionism. Next, I wanted to mention Yasuo Konoyoshi again. He was the one who we saw his interior view looking out the window. He's one of the most significant artists to keep a studio in the building. He was an influential Japanese American painter, photographer, and printmaker. He immigrated to the United States alone at the age of 16, and he lived on the West Coast for a bit, and then he made his way east, where he studied at the Art Student League under Kenneth Hayes Miller, and along with others as well. He faced a lot of discrimination throughout his lifetime as a Japanese American, especially after World War II. And he was actually never granted American citizenship, though he lived the rest of his life in the United States and in New York. But he was the first living artist to receive a retrospective at the Whitney Museum of American Art. So a lot of kind of accolades and innovation. I won't spend too much more time on this building because there's lots more I want to show you, but 30 East 14th Street, like I said, had probably dozens of artists during this time period. So these are just a few. And I really liked this central painting by Howard Daum because it's a painting of his studio. So a different way to kind of get a glimpse into the inside of these spaces. So next, we're going to look at a cluster of still standing row houses on East 12th Street between Fifth Avenue and University Place. And here they are, again, a beautiful photograph captured by Dylan Chandler. And you will see the numbers are backwards because, yeah, the building on the left is 6, and then it goes 4 and 2. 6 and 4, as you can see, are a pair of Greek Revival style row houses that are much more intact than 30 East 14th Street is currently. All 3 buildings were constructed for the prominent businessman and philanthropist John Schermerhorn Bussing. And the 6 and 4 were built in 1845 to 1846. And number 2 on the right is an Italianate style brownstone fronted house constructed circa 1857. But let's get into who was living in these places. So at number 2 East 12th Street, and again, I want to really reiterate as I go through all of this, often I'm only pulling out 1 or 2 or a handful of people who lived in these spaces, and more often than not, there are so many other artists, and I could talk at you for 5 hours, but I definitely don't want to do that. If I were to go on and source even more information, but I highly recommend learning more about it because there's just so much rich information here. But at number 2, 2 examples of folks who were living there were Morris Davison and Elliot Orr. Morris Davison studied art in Baltimore and then at the Art Institute of Chicago, and then with painters in Provincetown, Massachusetts. And Elliot Orr was born in Flushing, Queens, but he moved to Provincetown, Massachusetts in 1924, later came to the Village in the 1930s. But I thought it was interesting that these 2 artists who both have a connection to Provincetown and to kind of coastal imagery were here in this building at around the same time. Reginald Marsh, who lived in the building from 1934 to 1939. He also later lived, right before that, he lived across the street at 11 East 12th Street with another artist, Julian Alden Weir. But when he was at 4 East 12th Street, he was one of the key figures of the 14th Street School that I mentioned previously. He built on the work of the Ashcan School of Painters. He was taught by John Sloan at the Art Students League. And he was known to be a careful and detached observer of the human condition, and especially within the neighborhood that he lived and worked. He, as you can see in these images, he represented crowds of New Yorkers quite often in his work, depicting scenes of unemployed or the working class or kind of different layers of society. Also, as depicted in the image on the bottom here, burlesque shows and movie houses, Depression era homeless encampments, all sorts of things like that to really show the human condition. During the 1930s, when he was living at this building, is when he gained the height of his prominence. And his most celebrated works were produced during that time. And later on, he taught at the Art Students League, and a young Roy Lichtenstein would cite him as one of his most prominent influences. Rosemary Beck, another great example of seeing the inside of her studio, and you can see these look like original 6/6 windows to me. She was living there a bit later, though, in the 1960s, mid 1960s. And she was also an abstract expressionist painter, and she also did a lot of figurative painting, as you can see here. So next I'm going to do a little tour of those buildings that I mentioned previously, which are no longer extant, along 9th Street near University Place. But first, there is one building that's still standing. As you can see, this is a larger apartment building, but it was built a little bit later than the row houses that were demolished, but earlier than the kind of more modern apartment buildings that came in the 1950s. So this kind of towed the line between those time periods and has been in place since the early 1900s, I believe. And there are a couple of interesting artists who did live here. Hugh Ferris, a little bit of an outlier in terms stylistically and in terms of the scope of what he did, but I think he's really interesting. He quote, was the master draftsman of his time of the American metropolis, both real and ideal. And that was according to Carol Willis, the executive director of the Skyscraper Museum. In the course of his career, I believe he was trained as a draftsman or an architect, but he rendered hundreds of buildings and projects around the country. And he had this vision for the ideal city, and he illustrated a book around that called The Metropolis of Tomorrow. In 1922, and this image shows one example of this, he worked in collaboration with the architect Harvey Wiley Corbett to create a massing study in response to and to kind of illustrate and explain the relatively new at the time 1960s zoning law of New York City, which was the first time we had zoning regulations in New York City. And then I wanted to mention, this is one of those buildings, makes sense because it was a larger apartment style building, that a lot of different artists lived here over time. So Ogden M. Pleisner and Hilda Kane, they were both living in the building in the 1940s, and they were both landscape painters. So now we're going to look at a series of the buildings that are no longer here. Again, the historic images are those 1940s tax photos, so you can get a sense of what the buildings did look like when the artists were in them. And now they're more often than not these kind of 1950s to 60s modern style apartment buildings. So at 40, I wanted to let you know which buildings it is. So 47 is this one with the capped pediment up here and very decorative element. And then next to it with the fire escape is 51. So Vincent Spagna was at 47 and Francis Criss was at 51. Spagna was there in the 1940s, and he is remembered for his portraits done in a modernist expressive style. He would also paint city scenes and figural landscape pieces with a similarly modern technique. And then Francis Criss, who was actually in the building next door a little bit earlier than Spagna was, he was there in 1933 to 34, and his style, as you can see here, is a little bit earlier, a lot less abstract, but he's more associated with the American Precisionists. And the work from his best known years in the 30s and 40s is characterized by imagery of the urban environment, such as elevated subway tracks, skyscrapers, streets, and bridges. So you can see several of those elements here. And I just love this one because the Jefferson Market Courthouse, now library, is one of my favorite buildings in our neighborhood. I also wanted to mention his work is often kind of abstracted and like ambiguous, even though it depicts real landmarks. You can see in this example, there's like a few different elements that in reality, they don't all look like this in the same place. And it was almost always devoid of the human figure. Oh no, I lost my clicking capability. No, I think I figured it out. Okay. So here we are at 59, 61, and 63 East 9th Street, also demolished. The one on the left is 59, and then it moves progressively to the right. So at 59 East 9th Street, Israel Levitin was there in 1953. And this is our first example of a sculptor, though we'll see a few more in a little bit. He was an American abstract expressionist sculptor born in Lawrence, Massachusetts. He also did produce paintings and other fine art work on paper, but is particularly known for his woodwork. And then at 61 East 9th Street, James Brooke and Josephine Jo Levy actually resided in the building at the very same time. And James Brooks was an abstract expressionist painter. He did a lot of different work, but one of the things he's really well known for is this WPA Works Projects Administration mural, which still stands at LaGuardia Airport. Actually, I'm not sure if it does after the renovation, but it was there for a long time, and it depicts, as you can see, the innovation of flying, and it was a WPA commission during the Great Depression. And then Jo Levy was also a sculptor, but she also worked for the WPA, so maybe that has something to do with why they were living in the building together. 63 East 9th Street, Chaim Gross and Boris Margot. Chaim Gross was there from 1930 to 1953. He later moved to 109 East 12th Street and then to LaGuardia Place. I don't remember the exact address, but that's where the Chaim Gross Foundation is to this day, with tons of his work on display. I have it here. 526 LaGuardia Place, which is in the South Village Historic District. And he's well known for his use of direct carving. You can see him doing that here in this image. And though Boris Margot was there, didn't arrive until about 15 years after Chaim Gross got there. Chaim Gross was there from 1930 to 1953. Margot moved into the building in 1946. They clearly got to know each other. This image from a much later date shows them at an exhibition together. And one more of these demolished buildings on East 9th Street. Here lived Manuel J. Tulegian, Nat Werner, Arthur Osver, who I don't have an example of his work, but he was there too. Tulegian was a painter who painted landscapes and other still lifes. He was considered a social realist painter and often would paint images of people and the landscape of imagery in the nation, was also involved in the WPA efforts. And so a lot of his work is displayed still in government buildings in Washington. Nat Werner was a sculptor originally from New York, and he also studied at the Art Students League and at City College. And he worked in both the figurative and abstract styles, and you can sort of see the synthesis of that in his sculpture here. 52 East 9th Street. I actually kind of like the new building here from the 1950s with this kind of interesting curvature, but that's neither here nor there. Let's see who lived here. Franz Kline, who is arguably one of the more known of the artists that we're talking about tonight. He's also associated, of course, with abstract expressionism. He also had a studio for a time at 85 4th Avenue, which is also on this list. He started out as a realist painter, but after meeting Willem de Kooning, his style evolved, and you can see just how much it has evolved. Now, just a block or two north of where we just were with all those sad buildings that are lost, we have some great examples of still extant buildings. So this is a series of row houses on East 10th Street, and a lot of great people lived here. Jackson Pollock, of course, possibly the most household name of them all among who we're talking about today. But while he is, of course, most famous for his drip technique on the right, I thought it was interesting to show this untitled Western scene on the left, because this was some of his really early work, and it was the work that he was doing when he lived in the building in 1931. This Western scene was kind of a common theme in his early work. He grew up partly on a farm in Arizona, and the Western landscape was a recurring theme and inspiration for him. Uh, Yoongi was an artist, poet, philanthropist, teacher, writer, and inventor, and the first Chinese American artist to hold an important position in the history of Western contemporary art. He was the very first Chinese artist to have a show at MoMA, and you can see that he depicts a lot of urban scenes in his work. Jo Baer, one of the more abstract of those whom we're looking at tonight, and that's in part because she was a bit of a later time period. She lived at 53 East 10th Street from 1967 to 69, and she's still alive. And we have a couple of people that we're talking about tonight who are still with us. Mabel White was known for the satire that she captured in her lithographs. You can see an example of that here. She was an ardent leftist and socialist, and her political beliefs played into her work. Now we're going a little bit east to further east on 10th Street, where there's another really concentration of artists' residences. So here I did my best to patch together the row so that you can get a sense. These buildings are still standing, but have various degrees of alterations to them. But I wanted to try to give a sense of the streetscape from when the artists were living here. Selma Hortense Burke was one of the most notable sculptors of the 20th century, according to the National Women's History Museum. And while living here at 88 East 10th Street, she completed the Four Freedoms, which was a relief plaque commemorating President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and it was used as a model for his image on the US dime coin. Another really big name in the area, or in art history, and who lived in the area was Isamu Noguchi. He is one of 20th century's most important and critically acclaimed sculptors, through a lifetime of artistic experimentation and a career that has spanned 6 decades. I'm sorry, I don't know why I put that he only was alive in 1951. That actually is the year that he was living in the building. Anyway, but as I'm sure you may know, he has a lot of public sculpture work, as well as things like his famous table and other household items that he elevated. Willem de Kooning, who we'll hear about a couple more times in the next few minutes, he lived all over the neighborhood, but he famously lived at 88 East 10th Street for a time, from 1952 to 59. The Dutch American abstract expressionist artist is seen here in this great image, and here is an example of his work, but I'll touch a little bit more about him in a moment. Milton Resnick, a Russian-born American abstract expressionist painter. He worked particularly on large-scale canvas. And then Esteban Vicente, a nice pop of color, was in the building from 1962 to 63. All right, and then moving on to 61 4th Avenue, that is this red brick clad building here with the arches at the top. Another very famous name, Robert Indiana. Most known, of course, for his love imagery. I, in doing this research, found out that particular iconography first appeared in a series of poems that were originally written in 1958, which is when he first did this kind of stacking that he became so famous for. And I thought that was interesting because he lived in this building from 1955 to 56. So it was soon after living in this neighborhood that he first came up with this concept. I tried to find some earlier work of his. He did a lot of this graphic iconography early on in his career as well, and then developed from there. And then, yeah, so then moving just a tiny bit north from where we were, onto 4th Avenue. One more demolished building, but some great people lived and worked there. Both David Hare and Jack Twarkov lived there. And they were both there. Well, Hare was there until 1951, and Twarkov came in just after. So I'm not actually sure whether they replaced each other in the same studio or if they were in different units within the building. But as I briefly mentioned before, Willem de Kooning also held a studio here for a time, and many others as well. This building, I'm sort of indulging myself in including it a little bit because I just think it's such a stunning example of architecture, and it's shocking to me that it's not an individual landmark. But 806 to 808 Broadway, the Renwick, which runs the entire block from Broadway to 4th Avenue behind Grace Church on 11th Street, which is an individual landmark, was designed in 1887 by James Renwick, who also designed Grace Church. I did include it for a reason. Quite a number of abstract expressionist painters did live in the building. Sidney Gordon from 1953 to 58, Alfred Leslie from 57 to 58, and Sonia Gektoff from 58 to 59. 809 Broadway, this one is sad for my historic preservationist heart because it was recently demolished, and it's something that Village Preservation fought. But it's also from the 1880s, and its unique cast iron construction is often more commonly found further south in Soho, but here's an example. And you can see on the left what it became. But it's also an important site because Robert Rauschenberg lived there from 1962 to 65. And in each of his studios where he lived and worked, he created spaces to display his own artwork alongside other works that he would collect and curate. And he called this one on Broadway his treasure wall, and you can see it here. And then he is also quite well known and especially famous for his combines, where he would do a mix between sculpture and painting, as you can see on the right. Just a couple more things to show you. At 813 Broadway, Robert De Niro Sr. comes back. We talked about him right at the beginning at 30 East 14th Street. But after he and Virginia Admiral parted ways and got divorced, he continued on with his career, and he was in this building from 1955 to 61. And this is just a fun seeing it over time. The one all the way to the left is from about 1915. Then we have the 1940s and present day. Oh, and I wanted to point out, I'll just quickly jump back. This new building at 809 Broadway, you can see right next door is this little building, which is 813 Broadway, where Robert De Niro Sr. lived. Okay, so I wanted to conclude this discussion with two great success stories, example success stories of buildings that potentially faced the wrecking ball, but were saved in large part due to Village Preservation's ongoing advocacy work in the area. So these both are buildings that received landmark designation status relatively recently, thanks again in part to our efforts, and they also are incredibly important for art history. So the first one is 827 to 831 Broadway. And I just thought this was a really beautiful detail of the original iron elements. We successfully spearheaded this landmark campaign in 2016 to 17. These 1866 loft buildings were once home to Willem de Kooning, another one of his studios, and a vast array of influential art world figures. Also, critical figures in early American industry and commerce. Won't get into that now, but these buildings had a ton of things going on. But to quickly talk about some of the artists who lived there, I mentioned Willem de Kooning, Elaine de Kooning. The two of them were no longer married at the time, but they both had different studio spaces within the building. Elaine de Kooning also had other studio spaces in and around the East Village. And then Larry Poons as well. And others that I don't have time to get into, but one of these loft buildings that really had a ton of artists living there and working there. And then finally, sorry, something is funky with my map, but there should be a green dot there, and that is 128 East 13th Street, just diagonally across the street. And that is this really special building. And it's a 3-story Beaux-Arts building that was designed in 1903 by architects Jardine Kent and Jardine as an auction mart for horses and subsequently for automobiles. The part of the building facing East 12th Street dates further back to 1890. And it had a whole slew of purposes or uses over its lifetime. It was a vocational school for women during World War II, and then became the studio of artist Frank Stella. Village Preservation launched a 6-year campaign that was ultimately successful to secure landmark designation for the building. And we also, through our plaque program, designated this lovely plaque to commemorate that, or to commemorate his life there. So I wanted to conclude. Thank you for coming on this journey where I rambled off tons of information, and I hope that you learned some interesting new facts about artists and the building south of Union Square tonight. This is the map that I was referring to right at the beginning of our conversation, our South of Union Square map, and this specifically is our South of Union Square Artists Tour. So this is what you get when you click through to our artist tour. You can see the first stop is 88 East 10th Street, one of the buildings that we talked about this evening, and many others, many of the ones we did talk about, some that we didn't, and vice versa. And like I said, it's continually being updated as we continue to pursue this research. So thank you so much. This link here is the link to access that map, though if you just go to our website, it's fairly straightforward to navigate to it as well. I think we have a few minutes to answer a few questions. And I'm just trying to catch up by looking at the chat and Q&A. But Maya, if anything stood out to you as a couple of questions that I can answer, I'm happy to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. First things first, we seem to have a little bit of a PowerPoint malfunction. We will be sending this PowerPoint in a follow-up email so people can go back and look at the images and see some of the artists as well. First, as well, if you have any questions, please place them into the Q&A. And our first question is, were most of these sort of work-live studios? I believe many New Yorkers used to change residence a lot. Did artists stay put for longer? So it's a bit of a 2-in-1 question.
Many, but not all of these were live-work studios. So especially the smaller row houses along East 9th and East 10th Street were often a live-work situation. I will say I can't say with certainty whether that was necessarily legal, but it's what the artists were doing, often kind of squatting in their own studio spaces or vice versa, creating art in their living quarters because they either couldn't afford to have 2 spaces or they wanted to just kind of always be in their art. Some of the larger loft buildings, such as 827 to 831 Broadway that we just looked at, were more often just studio spaces. I think that artists maybe sometimes would kind of like camp out there for a night or two, but for the most part, those larger loft spaces were separate from the living quarters.
Great. So I guess another question is, it seems like a lot of the sort of buildings on 9th Street were sort of demolished. We have one question that asked if the stretch of 9th Street buildings that got knocked down in the 50s and 60s were owned by the Randall family, who decided to develop that area. If you know a little bit about the history of sort of the 9th Street development in that sort of time period.
That's a great question. I know that we have documentation about that in our village preservation archives. I don't know the specifics of it off the top of my head, but I can certainly look into it and respond to that via email.
Yeah, of course. Um, and were all of these artists sort of renters, or were some of these artists able to sort of buy their buildings or buy their apartments or anything?
The vast majority, I'd say, were renters, especially, I'm sure, unsurprisingly, in these larger store and loft buildings along Broadway and Fourth Avenue. Um, uh, there was the potential to buy perhaps a unit, but I think for the most part they were renting. And as you could see in the course of the presentation, often artists would only be in those studios for a few years at a time, and they would move around a lot depending on their situation. And often they would like hand down their studio to the next artist, and they would kind of rent from each other in that way.
Oh, fascinating. Another thing I would like us one person asked about is sort of when did a lot of these sort of buildings south of Union Square sort of be converted from sort of locked as commercial buildings to apartments, sort of the locked apartment kind of. If
Um, like in the, I'm not sure what you're asking in that question, whether it's like more recently or during the time that the artists were there. Um, but I can try to look into that further too.
yeah, sorry. Um, yeah. Um, so I guess another question is from Dorothy Wong was what were these buildings used formerly? I think she's referring to sort of the commercial buildings or loft buildings. Um, could you speak to that sort of history?
Yeah, a lot of the artist loft buildings were constructed as either commercial or industrial or manufacturing spaces, especially along those thoroughfares of 14th Street and the avenues. A lot of commercial activity was taking place as the neighborhood was transitioning. And so they were purpose built to be for commerce and industry. And then artists, saw the great natural light that you get from those the large windows and everything, and found opportunities to take advantage of that.
Great.
Uh, Sorry, to add to that, I guess maybe this is a little bit more self-explanatory, but the row houses that you see more closer to like kind of the south and west area, closer to the heart of the village and on East 9th Street and East 10th Street, those were originally built typically in the mid 1800s as single family homes. And then over time, they would often be converted to multi-residences. So like each floor would have a different residence. And so when artists moved in there, a century after their construction, they would often take either a floor or even a portion of a floor that was their apartment or studio space. And so those buildings were continuously residential, but they kind of shifted in how they were used.
Hmm. I guess one last question is, could you speak a little bit to the landmarking of 827 to 831 Broadway? Um, I think we have a question about about sort of if this sort of helped or affected the sort of tenancy of a lot of the people living there, or if you just want to talk a little bit more about the actual landmarking process for.
Um, yeah, I know there were some, I guess, issues over time regarding people's tenancy in the building, but the landmarking process was separate from that. And that's the part that I know more about. So I can talk a little bit about that. So like I said, in 2016-17, Village Preservation succeeded in our campaign to get 827 to 831 Broadway designated individual landmark status. Achieving landmark status for that building or any building for that matter doesn't impact ownership or tenancy or anything like that. It really just serves to regulate what renovations you can make to the building. And so certainly, that could impact if somebody has a tenancy there and they want to make certain changes to the building, maybe they can no longer do that. Though I will say that landmarking doesn't preclude one from making changes at all. It just simply gives oversight to the Landmarks Preservation Commission. So that, and the reason why we often advocate so strongly for it, and especially for this building, if it hadn't have been landmarked, it was actually potentially going to be flagged to be demolished and a new kind of like tech hub building constructed there in its place, kind of like what we saw at 809 Broadway earlier in the presentation. And so in this way, I would say that landmarking in this case actually protected the tenants who were there, because otherwise they ran the risk of everybody in the building getting evicted for the new construction to come in.
Great. So we're almost out of time, but I think I have one personal question for you is, do you have a favorite artist that you sort of found while, doing this research as well? Do you find that there's a particular artist that you feel, I would say, it, embodies the sort of spirit of the sort of architectural styles of South Union Square, or sort of really was in communion with, New York architecture and New York landscape, the New York landscape?
That's such an interesting question. I off the top of my head, I think that I was really interested to learn more about Willem de Kooning, just because he pops up in quite a number of different buildings within the area. So it's interesting to trace like where he lived and what art he was creating at that time. And then he would move and his artistic style would develop. That one, his work is quite abstract. So it's not like, some of the examples where you see literal depictions of the neighborhood. But I think, I like to think, and I believe for myself and other creative people, that the physical space that you inhabit really influences the work that you put out into the world. And so, yeah, I think that's really interesting. Not saying necessarily that he's my favorite, but I think that he encompasses what you were asking, Maya, about how you can kind of like trace the impact that the artist and the physical space had on each other.
Well, thank you so much, Gina. This was an absolutely wonderful presentation. We will be sending out a recording of this event as well as the PowerPoint, so people can go review the buildings, the artists, and learn as much as they can from this wonderful lecture. Thank you very much and have a wonderful evening, everyone. Bye-bye.